Chapter 29, Part 3. Continued. His stroke, I said. Yes, in 2005. He was 71 then. So that's when Ernie and Sam moved from Portland to Exeter, I said, clarifying what I'd found out from the locals in the pub at Southwell. Yes, that would make sense. They moved in with Arthur and William. It was a big stroke. It paralysed Arthur on one side of his body, and he lost his ability to speak. He would have needed full-time care from that point too. Ernie and Sam gave up everything to look after them both. You can't put a price on that kind of friendship. What happened to the business? I asked. I think it must have just petered out. Maybe it was already finished before he had the stroke. I don't know, to be honest. But I'm guessing with the money from the business and the sale of the house in Portland, they were able to get by financially. But the pressure must have been awful. Samantha died of cancer in 2008. She hadn't been ill long. It seemed to have happened so quickly, I told her. Yes, that was the year before Arthur. Arthur died in 2009, leaving William with no one, except Ernie. Although not a blood relative, Ernie took on sole charge of William's care. So much sadness in such a short space of time. Ernie was 80 years old in 2009. How on earth could an 80-year-old care for a 23-year-old man who had such a debilitating illness? I asked her. I've no idea, she replied. But he did. William didn't come into Suffolk Court Care Facility until 2012. Ernie must have cared for William all by himself for 3 years or more. And when he was able to talk clearly, William would tell me all sorts of stories about his time with Ernie. He treasured him, loved him to bits. Ernie used to take him everywhere in the wheelchair, even at that age. He must have been the fittest 80-year-old around. They used to regularly go to the coast on days out. They'd visit Dartmoor and Exmoor and Torquay, to name but a few. They used to take the bus or the train and go all over. William told me they used to sit for hours and hours telling jokes or stories. Ernie could make him laugh like no one else could. I think they helped each other cope after all they'd been through. When William was with Ernie, he never felt restricted, lost, or helpless. I can't imagine what it must have been like to have such a sharp mind, but be stuck in a body that doesn't work as it should. Ernie gave him that love of life. He loved him and cared for him so much. You can tell so much of this just by the way William talks about him. She had a tear in her eye, but didn't even try and wipe it away. Ernie was 83 when William was moved to Suffolk Court. Was he still able to visit? I asked after a few moments' reflection. Visit? She said. He would visit William every day, without fail. Sometimes he would stay for an hour, sometimes all morning or afternoon. He was very much dependent on William and what he could cope with. Sometimes he would get very tired and needed to sleep, but Ernie was always there when he needed him. They couldn't go on day trips out anymore. Ernie was too old for that. Don't get me wrong, he wanted to, but we insisted they just use the garden instead. And they would sit there for hours. Ernie taught William about the different types of flowers and trees, the birds and the insects. They kept scrapbooks together. We often had to drag the two of them back in. I'm sure they'd have stayed out there all night if we'd let them. But the thing is that in spite of all their chats, Ernie told William very little about his own life. And William didn't ask, even though he probably would have loved to have known more about Ernie. Probably now it's too late. It torments William, I'm sure. He's been desperate to know about what made Ernie the man he came to know. The man who was such a loyal and caring friend to his parents and to him. She paused. That's why we had to find him, or at least find out about him. We sat quietly for a moment before I continued, changing the subject slightly. So when did you move here? What did Ernie do then? I moved to this house, to this facility, at the same time as William. It was the start of 2017, and William was nearly 31. Ernie must have been nearly 87, she said. Where was he living at that time? Still in Exeter, I think, she said. I'm not sure where. When Arthur died, his own property was sold, and the proceeds were used to pay for William's care. The bills are astronomical here. £1,700 a week. Any money from Arthur's estate would have been spent on care costs. I thought again about Ernie's situation. Having lost his wife and close friend, nothing was in Ernie's name. He would have had no income, no pension. Where would he go, or where would he live? He had no one else, I said. I could feel myself starting to cry. I know, Paul, and I don't have the answer to that question. He did have money, though. He still came to visit William, although not every day. There was one week he didn't come at all. That must be the week he went up to Carlisle. 2017, wasn't it? She said, handing me a tissue. Yes, it must have been. How did he seem to you then? He was an old man, she said. He was starting to fade. I don't know where he was living, but whenever he came, he was always immaculately clean and well turned out. It dawned on me around that time that, of all the times he'd come to visit William, of all the times I had talked and laughed and joked with him, I knew so little about his life. In his later visits, I could tell he wasn't himself. I sat him down in this very conservatory once, after he'd visited William, to ask him if he was all right. He confided in me that he wasn't well. He said he was forgetting things, normal, everyday things. He had talked to a doctor at the hospital, and she had mentioned memory loss and possible dementia. He was supposed to go to the hospital for treatment. I'm not sure he did, though, she said, smiling. He was very much his own man, even then. When was the last time you saw him? It must have been around Christmas time last year. It was a freezing day, but the two of them still went and sat outside in the garden to talk. That is when he gave me a letter. She stood up at this point and walked over to a chest of drawers. She returned with a small brown envelope and handed it to me. Open it, Paul. Read it. I'm sure William would have wanted you to.